All right. Welcome, everybody. It's great to do this tonight. I'm really excited about what I'm going to share. And I didn't think, I wasn't thinking about this, but then when I started to look at it, I was like, wow, this is so important. And the reason why it's so important that we discuss unity today is because we spend a lot of time with one another, and we do represent various groups. And I have been meaning to talk about this because as we get to know each other a little bit better, uh, we have to continue to keep the unity of the bond of peace. And it's not just in this group, but in all the Zooms and churches that we participate in. I'm glad I have this opportunity to talk about unity tonight because it is important for us to be working together, loving one another, and learning to be our best for one another. The battle is real, and I don't know much about um, battlefield strategies or anything like that. I know some people um, might know more about that than I do. Some people who are very into history will know all how battles are won and how they went about it and the victories and that sort of thing. But one thing I do know about a battle is that you must work together. And so we must have each other's backs, and just like in a marriage. And it's important for us to continue to build healthy relationships one with another and continue to encourage one another and build each other up. So, I think about too, I just want to say that nobody has a target on their back on this one. This is just something that I think we can all learn from. And it's kind of like when you were a kid and if you had a hole in your sock, you were sure everybody knew that you had a hole in your sock. And so as I was going over this material, I kept thinking, wow, I could learn from this. So I hope that you enjoy this as much as I have. All right. So we know in Ephesians 4, it says, therefore I, a prisoner for the sake of the Lord, urge you to walk in the manner worthy of the calling with which you were called. And why should we walk worthy? Well, we've got to go back and look at what the therefore is there for, because of what is written before this is why he is saying that we need to walk worthy. Well, why do we need to walk worthy? Well, if we go back to Ephesians 3, before we get to Ephesians 4, it gives us some good reasons why. It says, surely you've heard of the administration of the grace of God that was given to me for you, and that the sacred secret was made known to me by revelation, which was not made known to people in other generations. This is the sacred secret that the Gentiles are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body and fellow partakers of the promise through the good news in connection with Christ. Good stuff. This grace was given to me, and this is all paraphrased, so you can go back and read it, so that I could proclaim the good news to the Gentiles about the unfathomable riches of Christ, and so that I could bring to light, this is Paul, for everyone, what is the administration of the sacred secret, which has been hidden for ages in God, who created all things. In union with him, we have boldness and access and confidence to God through our trust in him. And so this is the sacred secret. This is the big deal. And it's hard for us sometimes in our culture to recapture daily what Paul was saying, because it is so much a part of our lives right now. We're so comfortable with it. It's just like with my grandson, Chandler. He doesn't understand how amazing a cell phone is. I'm still like in awe of cell phones. We didn't always have that. And so we understand how wonderful that is. And it's kind of the same thing with when the administration of grace was brought into fruition, and Paul was giving them this great news that now the Gentiles were fellow heirs and members of the body. You have to remember, we were dead in trespasses and sin. We were without hope and without God in the world. Now, again, in our culture, it's harder for us to know because we've always had this available to us. And now it was such a big deal for them to learn that. And also, it's just like color TVs and cars and, all that sort of thing. We just have these things and we don't actually remember to be thankful. I am thankful every week for my washing machine though, because I remember having to go to the laundromat, and that wasn't so much fun. So I've never forgotten to be thankful for that. But anyway, even in the light and the glory, which by the way, I will at the end give you, I'll give you more information about any books that I reference through this. But in the light and the glory, one of the things they talk about is by the time the second generation Puritans came around, they were in serving Christ the way their families did when they first came here. And to us, that seems crazy. Well, what do you mean they didn't serve Christ? You know, these are the Puritans, and yet they too got caught up in the, oh yeah, life is great. You know, I know how to plow. I know how to fish. I know how to do this. Me. And their parents and the people, the generation that came before them, their very lives depended on Christ each and every day. They had to serve God in everything that they did so that their land could prosper, that they would be safe from harm, that they would eat and their crops would grow. By the second generation, they had gotten pretty comfortable and they weren't seeing it as big. So I guess I'm just trying to capture again the administration of grace and how big a deal that is. And what is he saying? It was unfathomable. There's unfathomable in the REV. It says it means not able to be searched out or tracked. God didn't tell anybody about this. And yet now we are part of the body when we used to be dead. This is as big a deal as if your grandma, or my grandma, who's not alive anymore, if my grandma got up from the dead right now, it would be no more miraculous than what we have been given. We have boldness and access to God with confidence. For this reason, I bow my knees to the Father, from whom every family in heaven and earth is named. I pray that he would grant to you and strengthen with power in your, that he would grant to you to be strengthened with power in your inner self through his Spirit, according to the riches of his glory. It's trouble when you memorize these verses in King James English, then when it's translated different, you get all tongue-tied. And that Christ would live in your hearts through trust, so that you, being rooted and grounded in love, are able to comprehend with all the holy ones what is the width and length and height and depth, and thus are able to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you are filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do far above all that we ask or think, according to his power that is at work in us. To him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus for all generations, forever and ever. Amen. And so what was Paul's response to that, to this, all these things, that the Gentiles were fellow heirs and of the same body? He bowed his knee. He was showing, it's a form of worship, of submission. But he prayed that the believers would be strengthened. And I know this is a prayer, but these prayers that he prayed were God-breathed. God wanted them in here so that we knew that we could be strengthened with power in the inner self, and that Christ would live in our hearts through trust, rooted and grounded in love. And what is the breadth and length and depth and height of his love? And that we are filled with all the fullness of God. And he is able to do far beyond what we could ask or think. Okay, so with all of that said, and all of these promises given to us, how are we going to walk? Let's go back to Ephesians 4. Therefore, I, a prisoner for the sake of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling which you were called. We have been giving all these great promises. So he's asking us that we walk with all humility and meekness and patience, bearing with one another in love, being diligent to keep the unity which comes from the Spirit by keeping the bond of peace. So what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to put off the old self that belongs to our former way of life, and that is being corrupted because of deceitful desires, and renew the thoughts of our minds and put on the new self. Just renew our minds and bring all our thoughts captive to Christ, which has been created in the likeness of God in true holiness and righteousness, and get rid of all bitterness and rage and anger and angry shouting and slander, along with all malice. So these are some of the things that we need to do to walk worthy of what we've been given. And first of all, humility. It's Proverbs 22:4 talks about the reward of humility. The fear of Yahweh is wealth, glory, and life. And so it's certainly worth looking into. And meekness is the feeling of patient, submissive humbleness. And, it's okay. We don't have to, sometimes when I think of humility and meekness, I think of someone who's quiet, and that doesn't necessarily that doesn't mean meekness. Yeah, but I'm not going to go too far into that right now. We got to have patience and a disposition to be patient and long suffering, bearing one another in love. And that's to forbear, put up with, endure, sustain yourself sustain yourself, and be tolerant of one another. And these are a big deal. It's easy to love God because of all he's done. It's not as easy to love one another because we're not perfect people, but we're supposed to keeping the unity by being diligent and keeping the bond of peace. And this also, we're putting off the old self, putting on the new self. And this doesn't mean that you let people walk all over you either. You got to have healthy boundaries in your life and understand that. I see often too many women, Christian women, put up with stuff that they shouldn't, and it just sucks the life out of them and the joy out of them. And so you've got to have a balance there. And yes, you should push. You should give as much as you can, but also know your limits. I know for myself, um, well, I know we're supposed to be hilarious givers, but if your motivation is wrong, then there's no reward in it for you. It says in Matthew, "Verily, you already have your reward." And so the book Boundaries would really help people with that, understanding better how to set them. And also, I know, like I said, for myself, sometimes I just take on more than I should because I just want to give, and then I jump in too far, and then I got to pull back a little, and that's hard too. But one of the one-liners in the book Boundaries, it says, if you can't say no, then your yes means nothing. And think about that for a minute. When we say yes to helping somebody or doing something for the Lord, it's because we know we can say no if we wanted to. And that just makes our yes so much bigger. We all have free will to do what we need to do. So the next one on here is bitterness, and that's sharp or acrid, using a sharp tongue or sarcasm. And as I was telling you, I was gonna scold us all on this, is that when we're discussing doctrine, I get it. We're passionate about it. We're passionate people, and it's good to be passionate. But things are going to come up, and we're not all coming from the same place, and that is okay. And it's okay to discuss things and be passionate about things, but we need to also be careful not to belittle or help or take offense with one another's differences. Danny and I worked in churches for many years, and over the years we've prayed and ministered to hundreds of people that had a lot of doctrine that was different than ours. Now, I will say that Danny and I always were very clear with the leadership in any group that we were with, what our doctrine was and what we believed. We didn't want to deceive anybody, but at the same time, there's so many things that we can agree on when we're walking by the Spirit of God, when Jesus is the head of the body. And you see that all the time. I know people that go to some of these local churches, and they'll, oh yeah, we learned this, our pastor taught on this, our pastor taught on that. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I heard the same teaching, from one of my groups on the same subject this week. It's like Jesus is still the head. He still works with all of us, regardless of all the other stuff. So I'm telling you, just to be kind one to another, especially when it comes to our doctrine. But it does say in 2 Timothy to tell, and when it's talking about teaching, it says to teach in meekness, correcting those who oppose the truth. And that's really important. I don't believe we should put doctrine over love. And that's a tough one, but we've got to learn the balance of grace and truth. And there's another great one-liner from the book called Grace and Truth, the Grace and Truth Paradox. It says, grace doesn't lower the bar, it helps people over it. And I thought that was a great way to look at it. And so also we need to be careful about slander, speaking against one another, malice, which is ill will or desire to injure. Don't like to go there at all. But if you've gotten that far, you got to come back and, pull it back a little bit and find out why you're struggling in that area. So we're supposed to just encourage one another and just be careful of speaking out of turn about our sisters and brothers, because speaking life to one another and for one another and for ourselves really does make a difference in our walks with God. And it affects our health. It affects everything about us, our lives, the things that we're involved in. We got to remember, why did the children of Israel, not the first generation, not go into the promised land? Because of complaining. Yikes. So I know that's a bad one for me, so I got to be careful. Okay, so one of the things that I've found over the years, talking to different women in different Christian circles, is I've tried to encourage women not to speak ill of their husbands. And when they do take the high road and begin to instead pray for them and love them and speak kindly to them, they see a big change in the husbands as well. So we can make a big difference depending on how we speak to ourselves and to one another. Okay. So, how to walk? Instead, be kind one to another, tenderhearted, forgiving each other, just as God has forgiven you in union with Christ. And remember, we've just got to remember, God forgave us. We have to take people where they're at. My granddaughter right now, she's 5 years old. I didn't call her last week and say, "Did you get a job yet?" Of course not. She's 5, but I do expect her to do her letters in school correctly. Or we used to have that's where she's at. That's her age. We used to have a joke that we'd play on the baby, when Stephanie was a baby, she'd start crying and we'd be like, "Will you stop being a baby?" And that's ridiculous. She's a baby. So, just to keep in mind that we just got to meet people where they're at. We expect babies to cry, and we've got to work with one another. And I know that looking back in life at my mother-in-law and some of the things she put me through in life, I have to say it was wrong of me to expect her to be more than she was. And so we have to remember that when we're working with people. And I often tell a story about my nephew Ben. And if I've told you, it's just cute. I got to tell it again. My nephew Ben, when he was 3, his mom had an Easter basket on the table full of candy. And his mother says, "Okay, Ben, I'm going up to take a shower now. Do not touch that candy." And so when she came down from the shower, this candy wrapper is all over the floor, and he's under the table with the basket eating the candy. And so she's like, "Ben, I told you not to eat the candy." And he says, "Mom, I'm 3. Thought, you know what, for a 3-year-old, that's a pretty smart answer. But we've got to take people where they're at, and that means with us as adults too. And a great tool to help us not struggle with forgiveness is to be unoffendable in the first place. And we got to be tough-skinned and don't take offense. And, I don't try to hurt other people. And when I do, it's not in malice. I'm just socially awkward sometimes. Sometimes people do stupid things, and we have to just accept each other for where we are. And I remember years ago, Danny, while I was out, I was at swimming. I had gone to the Y to go swimming, and I was going to be gone a couple of hours and run some errands. And him and his friend thought they'd do me a favor, and they were going to surprise me. And they built this towel warmer in my bathroom upstairs. And it was just these god-awful pipes just twisted all over the place and all over the wall. And it was just so ugly. And they had wired it into the heating. I don't know what they did, but they made a towel warmer for me. And Danny does plumbing, obviously. And so I came home and they're like, okay, Liz, come on, we got a surprise for you. And I went upstairs and the two of them are beaming ear to ear that they did this towel warmer for me. And I walked in I had no idea what they were going to show me. And I walked in the bathroom and there's this thing all over my walls and stuff. And I just burst into tears. And so they meant well, but you know what? It was horrible. And I made them take it down. So I felt bad, but they really bursted their bubble. Anyway, Unoffendable is a great book. I think it was Regina. Regina, you're the one I think who told me about it. Um, and and again, I've got all these books posted at the end. And basically in the book he just tells us we're all flawed. And he was telling a story of how somebody pulls him over. I don't remember the whole story. It's been a while since I read the book, but somebody cuts him off, and he's got to come over, and he stops and he parks. And this guy gets out of his car and runs over and starts yelling at him. What do you think you're doing? You cut me off over there. You're a real jerk, blah, 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 blah. And his response was, yep, you're right. So where do you go from there? He's like, I'm a jerk. I do stupid things all the time. And it just makes it lighthearted. It just takes the sting out of some of these things. Whereas, in order for us to be loving and encouraging one another to grow, we have to forgive one another and just try to be thick-skinned and not get so offended so easily. And let's not forget the parable of the wicked servant in Matthew. He was forgiven a massive debt, and then he had no mercy to forgive a small debt that was owed him. We don't want that to be us. Okay. So George Whitefield, he lived in the 18th century, and I think he was born in Gloucester. Yeah, Gloucester, Massachusetts. And by the time Christianity came to this point, this is way after the Pilgrims and the Puritans and all these different groups. After this, they began to have just different factions of Christianity, and it was spread all over and very much divided due to different doctrines. So Whitefield, born in Gloucester, Mass., became an itinerant preacher and an evangelist, and he took his message of the good news on the road and preached everywhere. And when some of the churches wouldn't take him in, he preached outside, and thousands would gather to hear the message of unity. So I'm going to read an excerpt from Light and Glory about this man and what he did. In Charleston, people were discovering that Jesus died for their sins, that he could and would forgive sin, and that they need not continue any longer under the bondage of sin. In New Haven, Providence, Peekskill, and in Baltimore, they were all making the exact same joyous discovery. And because this was so important, more important than anything else in their lives, geographical barriers became no more significant than denominational ones. They were still there, but they were inconsequential alongside the magnitude of their shared experience. They were beginning to discover a basic truth that would be a major foundation stone of God's new nation, which by 1776 would be declared self-evident, that in the eyes of their Creator, all people were of equal value. But the sovereign acts of the Almighty God, by the sovereign acts of the Almighty God, and through the obedience of a few dedicated people, the body of Christ was forming in America through universal, simultaneous experience of the Great Awakening. Americans began to become aware of themselves as a nation. They began to see themselves as God saw them, as the people chosen by him for a specific purpose, to be not only a city upon a hill, but a veritable citadel of light in a darkened world. And then he goes on to say, now, through the shared experience of coming together in large groups to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, Americans were rediscovering God's plan to join them together by his Spirit in the common cause of advancing his kingdom. The new day would soon break across the nation. His dream had come true. America was a nation now, one nation under God. And what's so amazing about this account, and certainly you can look up George Whitefield, or Whitefield, yeah. This took place, and his last sermon was given not long before the Boston Massacre took place. And of course, if you know anything about histories, by then the Americans had unified and were able to take on the oppressor. And if they had not been unified, if they had not had that great awakening, who knows where America would be today? You have to be unified to win a battle. And so all of this took place just as the American Revolution was becoming a part of our country's history. I thought that was pretty cool that the Lord had sent this man at this time to do this work, right in line with the coming of our American nation. That was pretty cool. And when I talk about the, being uniform, I'm not talking about the one world order either. I'm talking about being unified by the Spirit of God that lives in us, that Jesus is Lord, and that's who we serve. Okay, so then you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but you are fellow citizens with the holy ones and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone. In union with him, the holy building being fitted together grows into a holy sanctuary in the Lord. And in union with him, you also are being built together into a place where God dwells through the Spirit. We're in this together, and it requires unity. And there are battles, and we're on God's team. Remember that? We're on God's team. Friend playing on the front lines. Woo. Well, some of us remember that. Okay. And we got to have relationship with one another. And I was watching a movie the other night with Danny. It was called Jersey Boys. It was really good. It was about the Four Seasons, and they grew up in Jersey. I think they were Italian. Well, yeah, they were Italian. And in one part of the movie, one of the guys in the band got them $150,000 in debt. Now, this is back in the early 60s. That's a lot of money to be in debt. And they decided to take on his debt. And then one of the narrators said, if you don't understand why he did that, then you're not from Jersey. And so he was basically saying they were a family. And unfortunately, in our culture today, we're not much, the family is not as prevalent as it used to be. My grandmother would have killed for me. She had to. And I sincerely mean that, because when, I growing up in a big family, we were talking about family a little earlier, you did whatever you had to for the members of your family. Now, I'm not saying let's go out and kill people. That's certainly not what I mean. But that kind of passion and love for one another, that we'll do whatever it takes for one another, because out of love and compassion for one another. And in families, we have differences too. But you know what? You just work them out. Okay. So I wanted to bring up one more subject here. This is called Some of Jesus's Eye Roll Moments. And this is how he dealt with his folks. Sometimes we think he walks around all pious and great and everything, which he does. But this just shows the love that he has for his folks. And I'm just going to read a couple of verses that are just ridiculous what these guys do. The first one is from John. He says to Philip, Philip says to him, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Like, just show us the Father. And Jesus says to him, have I been such a long time, and you do not know me, Philip? Whosoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Okay, eye roll moment. I say eye roll because that's what I do. When I'm frustrated or think something stupid, I just roll my eyes. And Danny says someday it's going to get stuck in the back of my head. Anyway, okay. Another one. People were bringing little children to Jesus for him to place his hands on them, but the disciples rebuked them. I'm thinking about this. Can you picture this? Like people bringing little babies and toddlers up to see Jesus, and his disciples being like, "Cut that out! Get these kids out of here!" They must have looked so stupid. And when Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He says to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them." And he took the children in his arms, placed his hands on them, and blessed them. That's so cool. Okay. Matthew says, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said and cried out in fear. And I'm just thinking how funny that is because seriously, these are big, brave fishermen and they're crying about ghosts. And it's kind of funny, but you know what? I was thinking about it a little further and I don't want to kid myself. I probably would have been scared too. And then I'm going to just do one more where Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sing, cried out, Lord, save me. It's like you were doing it. What's wrong with you? And immediately Jesus reached out. He didn't just say, sink or swim, or he didn't say, figure it out. No, he reached out his hand and caught him. And he said, you have little faith. Why did you doubt? And so again, I just see these as eye roll moments for Jesus. And I don't want to go into this. There's so many more. There's just a few that I picked up. I mean, Martha, Martha, or get thee behind me, Satan. Can you imagine Jesus saying that to you? Get thee behind me, Satan. I got a T-shirt for that coming out. Um, or how about when he was praying for his life, and he said to them, "You couldn't wait 1 hour," and they fell asleep. Again, loving God is easy because he's perfect. Loving each other takes work. If you've ever been in a car with little kids fighting, we actually had to eventually get a minivan so they each sat in a different section because he touched me. No, he touched me first. And back and forth, and you're just rolling your eyes at the kids. All right, nobody, and you find yourself saying ridiculous things like, okay, don't anybody ever touch anyone else ever again. It's so ridiculous. But you know what? What kind of eye rolls does the Lord give to me? And yet each morning he greets me with his love. Okay, so Jesus had compassion, he loved, um, and what was his response to all his disciples' folly? Wash their feet. What was his response to the disciples denying him and betraying him? He gave his life in the most brutal way imaginable. Brothers and sisters, he is our example. And now it's our turn.